So we are utterly delighted this afternoon to welcome Henry McGhie, founder of the museum and heritage consultancy Curating Tomorrow, to explore the role that royal museums can have as catalysts for sustainable development. Henry's background is as an ecologist, as a museum curator and a manager, and he set his consultancy Curating Tomorrow up in 2019 to very much support museums to contribute to sustainable development agendas. Henry works internationally to support museums to build futures where people and nature can flourish together, and he's written numerous books and guides on museums and sustainable development topics. So we're utterly delighted that Henry's agreed to speak to us today, and also to answer any questions that you may have on how royal museums can contribute towards sustainable communities. Henry will be taking questions at the end, and so please do use the chat to note any queries that occur to you during Henry's presentation. And so without further ado, I'd like to pass you over to Henry.
Okay, thanks Hannah, and thanks for the opportunity to be here to talk with you today. And if I can just explain a bit about the kind of basis of my work. You can see the logo for my business, which is just me. The idea of curating tomorrow. It's really based on three ideas. The first one is that the future doesn't just happen by accident, we make it. The second is that the museum-based skill of curating, selection, attention to detail, has a part to play. And the third part is that museums and collections and the people that they work with have a part to play in this as well. And so what I'm going to talk about today is something called sustainable development, which you may not be familiar with, but something that rural museums can really play a very important part in. And so the image that is shown here is of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and I'll refer to them a number of times through the talk. And so a large part of the way I work is I write a series of guides on different sustainable development topics around museums and the Sustainable Development Goals, using human rights as a basis for our work, how to build resilience through museums, how collections can support biodiversity conservation, how museums and so on can contribute to the Paris Agreement, which is the Action for Climate Empowerment Guide, and a few others. And the most recent one only came out this week, which is about measuring and reporting your greenhouse gas emissions, which is of course a really crucial part of climate action. And you can get all of these for free from my website, and they circulate very widely. And so what we'll cover this afternoon is I'll talk through some of the principles of sustainable development and something called Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs as we call them for short. And I'll talk about how they relate to rural communities and rural museums, and how you can use them to set goals and make plans to contribute effectively to sustainable development action. So the kind of ubiquitous definition that we have for sustainable development comes from the 1980s, from something called the Brundtland Report, the Brundtland Commission, that sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And this is a definition that was developed by committees, so that explains why it is a little bit of a complicated definition. Basically, it's about working to try to make the future better, to leave the world in a better place than we found it. And so it's about not just stopping things going wrong, as people often think about with sustainability. It's about helping them to go right. It's about protecting and enhancing our shared wealth, and I'll talk about what is meant by that shortly, but also how we can share this wealth more equally, how we can create win-win-wins so that, that we respect human needs, we respect environmental limits, and we build social justice. So needs, limits, and justice can be thought of as the three priorities of sustainable development. And so I mentioned in the last slide about the idea of wealth. And we can think about this in relation to, like, if we think of a bank account, as is shown in the middle circle there. We're all familiar with the idea of a bank account where you invest some capital and then hopefully it builds some interest each year. And if you only spend the interest each year, then the value, the capital remains untouched. It can continue forever. And if you spend less than the interest, then the value actually accumulates. And we can use the same principle to think about our social capital and our natural capital. So what are these? So this is in a very simplified form. Our social capital is around our skills, education, our knowledge, our happiness, our relationships, our trust and peace and security in our communities. And our natural capital is the air we breathe, the water we drink, nature, which has value in and of itself as well, not just as something that we spend. So we can think in our lives, we need all three things. So although one can be converted into the other, you know, we might convert bits of nature into financial wealth. We can never allow them to go to zero because we need all three. But unfortunately, that's not the way our world works at the moment. We tend to over-extract nature to produce financial capital, and social capital lies somewhere in the middle. So I know there's a lot on this slide, but I'll just talk through it to explain really the difference between sustainability and sustainable development. Lots of museums, lots of organizations talk about sustainability and the importance of it, but it can become very confusing. So sustainability can become focused on how we define sustainability, and that can become a big rabbit hole. That becomes a rabbit hole that people fall down if they can't agree on what they mean by sustainability. It often is taken to mean that we try to use resources efficiently, that we try to stop things going wrong, which is the do less harm principle. It can become separated from the way we think about the external world. For instance, if an organization starts to talk about the sustainability of its budget, of its operation, or even the whole organization itself. Sustainability in that older sense becomes a bit over-focused on how resources are used. It often is talked about in relation to environmental issues, which can become a bit separate from social and economic challenges. It can often be thought of in terms of how an organization becomes more sustainable, which is another rabbit hole because you're either sustainable or you're not. More sustainable just then means being less unsustainable, is not really the same as being sustainable. And people and organizations are often not necessarily talking about the same thing. A group of people might think they're talking about sustainability, but if it means different things to different people and they have different priorities, they're talking at cross purposes. So let's move to talk about sustainable development, which is a different approach, but helps us get around many of those problems. So sustainable development helps get away from being focused on a definition of sustainability to being focused on the action. It's about action that helps us build a more sustainable world. And then as we do that, the picture of sustainability will become clearer. It's not just about stopping things going wrong, it's about helping them to go right, to do more good and do less harm. It's focused on actions to address external challenges, not just interest on what goes on within our own organizations. Sustainable development is not only about how we use resources, it's about human rights. So the reason that we have to use resources carefully is because they don't belong to each or any of us, they belong to all of us. That's a human rights-based principle, human rights-based approach. So sustainable development recognizes that we can't pull environmental, social, and economic challenges totally apart because they're related. Sustainable development doesn't just creep forward from where we are now. It looks at some goals, and then that helps us to build ambition and action to meet those goals. And it helps get away from this problem that people are not necessarily talking about the same thing. It brings us more together to work in a goal-based way. And so we live in a world with many, many problems. And when I say we live in a world with many problems, that means a world that's made up of countries with many problems, that's made up of communities with many challenges. So it's a scalable issue. We have inequality, mistrust between countries, self-interest rather than people working for the common interest, a lack of tolerance between different social groups. Governments make commitments that don't always happen. We have a big business which maintains the status quo, which doesn't help us move to a sustainable future. There's a lack of political will, which comes from a lack of public demand for change. And there's really a lack of awareness of challenges and a disconnection between the source of those challenges and where those challenges are felt, with climate change being the most obvious example. And so the latest programme that we have to address these many challenges is called Agenda 2030, which was agreed by all the world's governments in 2015, but was also it was shaped through in the 3 years before that through a huge public consultation exercise. 10 million people participated worldwide to look at a set of a vision, and then to create a set of 17 goals that outline the main challenges. If we could address these challenges, they're our best chance to get on a path to a sustainable future. And the goals which are shown here, and you can see them on even the flag in my room, they're just a picture. They don't make sense without referring to the document, which is really an amazing document, and you can get it for free on the internet very, very easily. It explains our world today, presents a vision of a better one, and presents the Sustainable Development Goals as this set of challenges for us to work together to achieve. And so Agenda 2030 is an ambitious programme, there's no doubt about that, incorporating all existing human rights and environmental agreements. So it's not really a new thing, it's a new way to achieve the many things that are just not being met. It was developed through this huge exercise, which I mentioned just before, and it was agreed upon by all countries. So every country in the world agreed that this is important, they commit to do it, but unfortunately it's not always really happening. So the goals and the targets that sit within them apply to every sector. It's been set out as an invitation, and a very important part of this is this principle of leave no one behind, and to support people's human rights everywhere. So not only is it an invitation to all sectors, it's an invitation to all people. But why should people do this? So again, if we look from a rights-based approach, people have a right to participate in shaping their own future. It's called the right to development, or the principle of self-determination. And we can think about this very concretely with rural communities and rural museums, and I'll return to that shortly. So let's think about the overarching aims of Agenda 2030. They're what we call the 5 Ps, because they all start with the letter P. So people, to end poverty and hunger and in all their forms. So poverty in terms of absolute poverty, relative poverty, and multidimensional poverty, and we'll return to that again. So planet, to protect the planet from degradation, so that we can use nature, we can protect and restore nature, use natural resources sustainably, and protect the climate. How we can ensure all human beings can enjoy prosperous and fulfilling lives, and that economic, social, and technological progress occurs in harmony with nature. This is the prosperity aspect. And so you can see it's not just about financial wealth, although that of course is part of it. And peace is to foster peaceful, just, and inclusive societies which are free from fear and violence. There can be no sustainable development without peace, and no peace without sustainable development. And what does this mean? It means that without sustainable development, we will just end up with conflict at different scales, whether it's between countries, between communities, between sectors, or so on. And partnership has the longest definition, which I don't even show all of it here, but is to mobilise everyone for this revitalised global partnership for sustainable development based on a spirit of global solidarity, focused on the needs of the poorest and most vulnerable, and with the participation of all countries, all stakeholders, and all people. And the reason I've put the whole definition here is because it's very important to remember this last part. So in terms of, well, how can we create participation of all countries, all stakeholders, and all people? Where concretely does that happen in society on a day-to-day basis? And museums and other public spaces are, of course, a great opportunity for this. And so let's think about some of the challenges that we have in rural areas. Well, we have social challenges, we have depopulation, isolation, a lack of services, whether that's cultural services, transport services, and so on. And we have an issue of gentrification, where in the UK now we have a growing issue with rural communities are unable to afford housing because the places where they live are attractive, that people want to live there, but they get bought up as holiday homes. They could become gentrified. We have environmental challenges in rural areas. There might be land use conflicts in relation to, for instance, whether land is used for agriculture or forestry, or if it's to be used for wind farms or other energy production. Or there's a growing issue now with buying land up to plant trees as poor quality carbon offsets, which is not quite right. We have declining biodiversity, unfortunately, in many places, climate change and pollution, which are the three overarching environmental challenges that we face. And they face economic challenges. They might be dependent on external sources of income, notably from tourism. There can be a lack of jobs, and there can be a lack of opportunities, leading to young people leaving and moving away. And this essentially just makes for unsustainable communities. It just isn't a sustainable community. But let's think about, well, what does a sustainable community look like? Well, it might mean that people live in, that places are good places to live, to grow up in, where people have good, long-lasting, strong relationships. They have good connections with other people, where nature is protected and restored and climate change is addressed. And where communities are affordable, livable places with vibrant, diverse economies, focused especially on small-scale production and services, especially of goods and services which are themselves good for the environment or for people. So let's think about rural museums as catalysts for sustainable development. They provide access to basic cultural services. We think like a museum in an isolated community, it might be the only real cultural service there is, although they may have access to a library as well. They can act as information hubs for other services. And they can reach out to people beyond the building. The idea that the museum is just in a place is of course just a very old-fashioned idea. And they can prioritise the needs and aspirations of local people over mass tourism, although of course that's not always what happens. And they can work with other sectors and help bring people together with the work of these other sectors. And so here's two different models to think about that may be helpful for rural museums. So two of them are the ecomuseum model, which an ecomuseum is often really misunderstood. An ecomuseum is not, the ecomuseum model is not about ecology or green issues. The ecomuseum model is about the relationship between people and heritage and the organisations within that. So it's more like a kind of distributed model, of which there might be a traditional museum as part of that, but it's more about the purpose and the management of heritage within sustainable development. And so the ecomuseum model was developed in France in the early 1970s, is used widely in South America, in Italy, in Japan, but not quite so much in the UK. There are, in Scotland, there are a couple of ecomuseums. There's one in Skye and there's one in Perthshire. But ecomuseums they remain something that's not so well developed in the UK. And it's the idea of a kind of distributed heritage resource where people draw on the past and the present to create their collective future. And the other thing that I would mention there is around sustainable tourism, which is not the same as ecotourism. Ecotourism is a form of tourism which bizarrely is often very unsustainable because it often has a very high carbon footprint. Sustainable tourism is really something that can be applied to all forms of tourism, which considers the needs of communities, and it considers tourism before people travel and after they have travelled, trying to really bring economic and social and environmental benefits and to reduce and eliminate the negative impacts. And there are some great resources from the Global Sustainable Tourism Council has this criteria for destinations, which is a really useful set of kind of principles, a kind of checklist. And there are two other things from the World Tourism Organization. There's one of them is called the Tourism for SDGs platform, which is a kind of collection of different resources. And the Global Code of Ethics for Responsible Tourism is also extremely good and worth a look. And so that brings us to the Sustainable Development Goals, the 17 goals that we can think about in relation to the work of rural museums, but also any other kind of museum, and in fact any other kind of organisation. But they can seem a little bit complicated or a bit abstract or a bit confusing. But the 17 goals address a whole range of different challenges, and they're not something that we just choose the ones that we are good at. We can think about them as a great big puzzle, and we're trying to solve the puzzle. How can we, how can we work differently to achieve all of these things? And so I wrote this guide back in 2019, really to help people use the goals in a really, I hope, a quite simple way. And really, I think there are 6 steps to using them. So firstly, to understand the goals as a connected framework. We're trying to achieve all of them. If we don't achieve all of them, we haven't done the work. You can decide what part you want to play in this, and you might ask your communities and other stakeholders, what part would they like to, what is their vision of a sustainable future, and how should the Rural Museum contribute towards that? Then the third part is to understand your positive and negative impacts on each of the 17 goals. And then to start setting priorities and making plans using these 7 activities, which I'll show on the next slides. Then you make a focused plan and you do it. It's quite simple. And then you review it and you renew it, and you make sure that you communicate your progress, both what's going well and maybe not what's not going so well, and see what can be done about that. And so I use these 7 activities, which are pretty much things that museums pretty much already do, or they could do, but it's also to say that a museum that is not supporting all 7 of them is not really operating at full capacity. But the other side of that is a museum that's effectively supporting and developing all of these things is really kind of firing on all cylinders, and that would be great. So in terms of how they protect and safeguard cultural and natural heritage, how they support education, how they provide cultural opportunities for everyone, supporting sustainable tourism, and so on. But I'll talk about them in the following slides. So firstly, protecting and safeguarding cultural and natural heritage is not just about having collections that we tried to save forever for a rainy day. We recognise that museums hold cultural and natural heritage in trust for society, but also they are concerned with the protection and safeguarding of cultural and natural heritage more broadly beyond their 4 walls. And this has its own target within the Sustainable Development Goals. And secondly, museums, rural museums, can support education for sustainable development. And that might be education for sustainable development is a whole approach to learning. It's a whole thing. And this relates to 3 targets within the Sustainable Development Goals. Education for sustainable development has its own target, promoting a universal understanding of sustainable lifestyles and supporting people's education to contribute to climate action. So whether you go near an SDG goal or target or not doesn't actually matter. Just if you work to support education for sustainable development, bearing these 3 things in mind would be terrific. The third one is around promoting cultural participation for everyone. And this is really important because the right to access cultural participation is a human right. It supports many other human rights. And we can think of this in terms of making sure that women and girls can access cultural participation, that we work to combat exclusion or marginalization or the things that cause people not to make use of museums. This can contribute to a number of these targets. And how we promote sustainable or responsible tourism are the same thing. And this has its own target within the Sustainable Development Goals. And this can be thought of as keeping tourism in perspective so that it prevents rural museums from just becoming, for argument's sake, a tourist destination, which is then closed for the remainder of the year. That is problematic for a few reasons. How you can work to avoid gentrification, how you can support the livelihoods of local producers and products, and how you can support low impact travel. So for instance, that might involve supporting installing an electric charging point, or having or sharing bus timetables, or making sure that people can access sustainable forms of travel wherever possible, which is not always possible because of where rural museums may be. So how, I'm sorry, this has jumped a bit. So how to think of collections and museums as a kind of infrastructure for society, how they can be welcoming and inclusive cultural infrastructures, how collections can be used as a basis for research, and or how you can use the museum to share the findings of research with communities. This could be terrific. So it doesn't necessarily just have to be research on your collection, but using the opportunities of the museum to communicate research more generally. That would be great. And so the 6th one is how we can make sustainable development part of everyone's work every day. So we can think of this in terms of target 8.8, which is about protecting labour rights. That might be in terms of how people are recruited, making sure that volunteers are being used in an appropriate way in institutions, which can also be challenging if there are funding challenges, and how the organisation can more generally adopt sustainable practices, you know, how you can make sustainability part of your everyday thinking and share the information with your stakeholders in your reporting. And the last one is to think about partnerships and collaborations for sustainable development. And this has 2 targets. One of them is about international partnerships, target 1716, and target 1717 is about cross-sector partnerships. But we shouldn't just think about this as using the museum as a kind of top-down to bring all the great work of the world to the local community. It's also about using the museum as a platform, as a conduit, to help bring people and their ideas and their responses and their concerns and their aspirations to the world. You know, it's a two-way thing. So very generally, we use sustainable development as an approach to make commitments that we wish to secure, we intend to secure a better future and to improve our contributions to the world. And we use the agenda and the goals to take part in this ambitious international programme along with others. And so if we can think of towns, countries, universities, colleges, schools, community groups, charities all around the world are working on this agenda is great. It has to be said it's patchy. Of course, some are working on it more than others, but there's absolutely no reason why a particular community shouldn't be, not allowed to take part in this. The only reason that they would not be able to is if they lack the information. And when we work with sustainable development, we don't just try to stop things going wrong, we try to help them go right. So we identify our positive benefits and we try and strengthen them. And we identify our negative impacts and we try to reduce and eliminate them. And then the progress with the positives and reducing the negatives is how sustainable development works over time. So we use the goals and targets to make concrete time-bound plans to do more good and do less harm, as I mentioned in the previous point there. And so if you want more practical information to really get to grips with this, I wrote these two guides. Understanding the SDGs and targets really explains what each of them is trying to do. And mainstreaming the SDGs is an interactive PDF that you can use to choose which targets you want to work with and to set goals, make plans, monitor and communicate your action. And so this is a page from mainstreaming the SDGs. So you can see here, there's one of the targets, target 4.7, which is described there. And then because I really believe that a goal without a plan is just a dream. So we need all of the commitment, we need the goal, what we're trying to get to, an idea of what it is that we're measuring so that we can understand how we can make plans and address them. And as I mentioned, it's an interactive PDF, so you can choose the drop down at the bottom of the page there, whether this is yes, no, or I'm not sure. And you can use this over time to strengthen your contributions to sustainable development. And so if we think that sustainable development is just an issue for the global south, we should think again. So this is a different way to look at the goals. You might have seen in the previous slides that there are 17 different colours. Here, the 17 goals are shown as a traffic light system. So green means that goal has been met, yellow means not so much, orange means even worse, and red means terrible. And this is the map for the UK from this year, from 2022. From a report called the SDG Index, which comes out in June every year. So although the UK ranks 11th in terms of countries in the world overall for sustainable development, you can see here there's not a single green goal. And this is a big problem. And we can see that some of them are really very worrying. So goal 2 there, which looks like zero hunger, is actually zero hunger, good nutrition and sustainable agriculture. So the UK is doing very badly with this. It's also doing very badly with climate action, and it's doing very badly with its partnerships. The partnerships is because of tax haven score. But you can also see beside the goals, there is an arrow. And so red means it's getting worse. Orange means it's not doing, it's just stagnating, it's flatlining. Yellow means it's improving a bit, and green means it's moving in a good direction. So the most worrying one to look at here is goal 10, reduced inequalities within and between countries, because we can see that the UK is going backwards. It's things that inequality is actually getting worse. So I just highlight this, that you could say, well, here are 17 challenges that affect the country as a whole, but they affect the lives of everyone in different ways. So we can see there's really a huge need for greater action from governments, of course, but we also need, all of society has got a part to play in this, and museums and so on can play a part, of course. So we need to understand the social, environmental and economic challenges and opportunities in the place where we operate. Rural museums could really look at understanding and questioning the local development plan, because there will be a local development plan for every community. They can work to involve communities, people, in determining their own future, because unfortunately local development plans may be developed by planners or authorities who have a particular idea of what development means. Development means many different things to different people. So the more that we can involve people in determining their own future, the more livable the community will be. But we can't just think about in a very kind of protectionist way, a very, very local way. We should also raise awareness of the challenges and initiatives elsewhere, so that we can enable and empower local communities, people, to contribute to the issues that matter to them. So for instance, climate change is a huge and very complicated topic, but on a day-to-day basis may not be the biggest issue that people face, but they may wish to address it. So if we look to prioritize the needs of local communities and ensure that their voices are heard, and that the voices that are heard are representative of the whole community, and especially creating opportunities for marginalized and underserved people and groups to share their views, could be a great way to support a more peaceful and tolerant communities and society. And so that's the end of my presentation, and I look forward to hearing your questions. Thank you. And I'll stop the share now.